I can record without having to be online. Okay. So those of you that are watching this video later, I know this is not the best option for the recorded lecture, but with the internet being the way it is today, I just kind of had to make something work. So hopefully you can see okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start today's daily listening. This is a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. Today's daily listening is a tune called The City in Motion, written by me. Yay. For the year, you can put 2020 as the year. That was when it was first published onto the YouTubes. And then the other questions you can answer on your own. So here is today's daily listening. Okay, so Day Listening, as I said, today was written by me. It's a tune called A City in Motion. So I do want to talk about it a little bit. So this was a project that came from this summer, shortly after we all got sent home. My musician friends and I were all bored out of our minds because we couldn't go and play together like we normally would. So I decided I wanted to put something together to do kind of a collaborative recording. A lot of musicians were starting to do that. And I had a couple of tunes that I wanted to record. This is a tune that I wrote a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, that I wanted to get a decent recording of. I didn't have one. So I got together with some of my friends to see if they'd be interested in doing this. And they agreed. And I think it turned out really well. So the guitarist that's playing with us is a guy named Jay Shepard. Jay teaches at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith. He teaches guitar and tuba and music theory up there. He's a phenomenal guitarist, and I like playing with Jay because he's a great jazz guitarist, but he's also really into like progressive rock and heavy metal. So we can kind of tie in some of those elements as well whenever we play together. The drummer is a guy named Slavik Bakluba, who teaches at the Ovation Music Academy in Bryant. His parents actually own that little music school down there, and he has a studio there, obviously, with his drum set and everything. And he pretty much keeps everything mic'd up and set up for recording. He does a lot of videos, so it was really easy for him to set up and record with us. And then the saxophone player is a guy named Brandon Doris, who is one of my very best friends. We lived together in college for a little while. He is the marketing director for the Arkansas Symphony. He lives in Little Rock and teaches lessons privately, works for the symphony, and also gigs as a musician. Makes a lot of money gigging. When we were in college, actually, he left college for a couple of years and was hired by Carnival Cruise Lines as one of their saxophone players on a ship, and was able to spend 2 years on the Fantasy from Carnival Cruise Lines back when it was going from from Cape Canaveral to the Bahamas, back and forth. So he spent a couple of years doing that, which is a really sweet gig. Yes, you have to live on a boat for that period of time, and you live in a small bunk with another person, but he made a good amount of money and worked about 3 hours a day doing it. So it was a pretty sweet gig. He had a lot of fun. It was something that I think he really needed in his life at that time. Came back a completely different person, and has been very, very successful since then. So Brandon's a great guy and a really good friend. So he's also playing, most of the instruments are normal, right? Guitar, bass, drums, bongos, saxophone. But then he also has this funky electronic instrument that I want to talk about real quick. Another reason I picked this video was to show off Brandon's newest toy. This is a electronic wind instrument, or EWI, E-W-I. And this specific one is called a NURAD, N-U-R-A-D, that you may have seen in the description or the title whenever it popped up. So the NURAD is a custom-made electronic wind instrument. They're actually still in prototype phase right now. And Brandon happens to know the guy that makes them, so he called him up and said, I really want one of your prototype NURADs. Here's the stuff that I want it to be able to do. Can you make me one? and the guy made him a handmade custom electronic wind instrument and sent it to him, and he's had it for about 4 or 5 months or so, pretty much since quarantine happened, and has been just having a blast with it. He and I usually get together and play around with our new electronic stuff pretty regularly. We haven't been able to do that in the last few months, so I haven't actually gotten to see and play with the new Rat in person, but it's a super cool instrument. It has buttons that pretty much mimic the fingerings of a saxophone or a flute or a clarinet. It also has buttons on the back that you control with your thumbs to control things like octaves, and you can do some pitch bending and other effects with it. You can add in different effects by a hit of the button. He also has a button that lets him, when he hits it, it'll play chords. So he can be playing one note and it'll play a full chord over the top of it. So he can play all these different notes and it sounds like moving chords. So a really cool instrument. It does have some built-in sounds, but it also has Bluetooth MIDI, so he can connect it to any synthesizer or computer and be able to do any sounds he wants from the computer or from the synthesizer. For this video, he's got it connected to a Behringer Neutron synthesizer, which is where he's getting those sounds. But because it's a wind instrument, you blow into it like you would a clarinet or a saxophone, and he's able to change the tone and the pitch that way. He's able to do some bend things and adjust the attack and the dynamic level like you would on a real wind instrument. And that's, you can't do that with a keyboard most of the time unless you have a fancy one with aftertouch. So pretty cool instrument. It's a lot of fun. Brandon has his own YouTube channel. If you want to check out more of his stuff, you can go there and check it out. Yes?
It's really kind of like the upbeat rhythm on this music, and it made me think of like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or something like that.
Oh yeah, it was really funny sharing this, as my own music because I'm getting interesting comments back from people. And by the way, I do want to tell you that feel free to be honest in your comments about stuff. You never have to worry about hurting my feelings or something. I want you really thinking, and I want you giving your honest opinion about the music. And it was really funny reading through some of the comments on Monday after my Monday classes. Somebody said that the music sounded like a screaming cat, but a screaming cat that they wouldn't mind listening to, which I thought was funny. Somebody said it sounded like they'd been put on hold, which I thought was pretty entertaining. So feel free to put comments like that. It does not hurt my feelings, and it usually makes me laugh. Okay, so that is the daily listening for today. Seems like our internet is holding up okay. I'm even actually able to share my screen with the Collaborate session for the time being, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so today we are actually going to get into part 1, chapter 1. I need to take roll real quick first for those people that are in class. So if I do call your name and you're in the chat, let me know that you're here. I tried to go ahead and mark all of you that have already put in the stuff, but if I missed you, just let me know. And those of you that are here, I'm going to try to get your names down because there's only a few of you, and I should be able to remember this. Kate? Yeah. Thank you. Grace? Thank you. Lawson? Lauren? Audrey? Oh, Audrey's in the chat. Sorry, earlier. Rebecca? She's been logging in online. Matthew? Jerry? Mon? And that's everybody's. Oh, Paige? You're not Paige. Casey? Okay. Cool. Okay, I think everybody else I got. Okay, so I will, those of you that are, this is my small class, obviously, so those of you that are showing up in person for the small class, hopefully we'll get your names down pretty quick. We'll see how that goes. Okay, So like I said, we are going to start in on part 1, chapter 1 today, and hopefully get through part 1, chapter 1 today, because part 1, chapter 2 will probably take us all day on Thursday. So a couple of things I want to tell you off the bat. First off, the listening assignment 1.2, you'll want to do that before Thursday. It's not actually due until September 11th, but that's what we're going to be going over on Thursday, and it'll be in your best interest to go ahead and do that one. You can skip the other ones and do that one first. It has some videos in it that talk about the different instruments, and it's a good idea to have watched those videos before you come to class that day. So I would suggest going ahead and doing that. We're going to do listening assignment 1.1 together in class today, just to make sure everybody understands how to do it. I've had some issues with some of the stuff people have been turning in, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable and know exactly what I'm asking and how to do these questions in class together. You can also go ahead and open up in Blackboard assignment 1.1, the multiple choice assignment, because we're going to be going over all that stuff today. So you should be able to complete that assignment in class. So I would suggest opening that up, read through some of the questions so you know what you're listening for, and then you'll be able to get that stuff done while we're in class today. Okay? And of course, this is being videoed, so you can always go back and watch it later if you want to get the stuff that way or out of the textbook. Either one is perfectly fine. Okay, so today we get into actual music appreciation stuff, the stuff that we're going to talk about in this class. The way that this class is broken down, the first part, the first unit here is basically kind of a light music theory class. We're going to talk about all of the terms, some of the ways that music works. We're going to break down some of the basics of music before we get into the other part of this class. So you'll have a pretty basic understanding of music. You'll even actually be able to not necessarily read music proficiently, but you'll be able to at least find notes looking at sheet music. That is something that we're going to go over, is how sheet music works so that you can identify notes that way. The rest of the class is pretty much a music history class. We'll look at all of the rest of music through the lens of music history. So we'll start back at 400 AD and we'll talk about the development of music from the very beginning, and that will also add in some other theory stuff as we go along as things are developed. But it's pretty much a history class starting at about the 4th week of class or so. So before we do any of that, though, we have to understand sound. We have to understand what makes music music. All right, so I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of going over the basics of sound here. And I'm not always going to go over every single thing that's on the slides. I'll kind of speed through some stuff, so you don't have to worry about writing down everything that's on there. Getting the main points is really all you'll need for this class. Okay, so sound, for those of you that have not studied sound before in science class or whatever, the way that sound works is that an object vibrates in some way, and it vibrates the air, and it pushes that air into your eardrum, vibrating your eardrum, and then your brain translates what's going on in your eardrum there and is able to take that and process it and translate it to something that you can comprehend, something that you can understand, whether it's words or specific noises so that you recognize, the air conditioner just came on in here, so you might have subconsciously thought, oh, the air conditioner just came on. Or you might have consciously thought, I'm already freezing, and he turned on the freaking air conditioner. Sorry, I do like to keep it cold. And I think it's pretty incredible that our brain can do that. It can take something as simple as airwaves being pushed around and translate that into stuff that we can comprehend, words that we can comprehend. All right? So there are certain sounds that we can actually break down and study even further. Okay, and we call those musical sounds. The sounds that we use to create music with can be studied a little bit of a higher degree. Okay, we're going to have 4 categories of those musical sounds. They're actually really elements of music that make up our musical sounds. So those 4 things are pitch, dynamics, tone color, and duration. You do need to know those 4 things. Okay, so all musical sounds have pitch, dynamics, tone color, and duration. okay? And really most objects, most sounds that you hear can be broken down into these categories. But we're going to specifically dive into what we consider to be musical sounds. Okay? Starting with pitch. The pitch of a musical sound is what determines the highness or lowness of that sound. Okay? And that's determined by the frequency of the vibration, whether we hear it as a high pitch or a low pitch. Okay? So if I come over to my piano and I play a low note, or as opposed to a high note, and you perceive those as a low pitch or a high pitch. Okay? The way that that's working is that when the air is vibrating fast, if it's a fast vibration of the air, it's going to produce a higher pitch. If it's a slower vibration of the air, it's going to produce a lower pitch. And generally speaking, larger objects are going to vibrate slower, so they're going to produce a lower pitch. And smaller objects are going to vibrate faster and produce a higher pitch. And that works itself out for instruments for us. So if you think about brass instruments, you have a tuba, which is a big giant piece of metal. It's a big metal tube, effectively. That produces low notes. It's a very large instrument. It's a long tube that the air goes through. So the vibrations coming out of that are very slow, and it produces lower notes. As opposed to a trumpet, which is effectively the same design, just miniaturized, is going to produce higher notes, higher pitches, because it's a smaller object vibrating faster. The same thing with a flute compared to a bassoon. It's effectively working the same way, but it's going to produce higher pitches. Same thing with string instruments. If you look at a violin versus a double bass, they're really the exact same design. But because the bass is so much larger, the strings are fatter and longer, they're going to vibrate slower, and they're therefore going to produce a lower pitch. Okay? And the cool thing is with string instruments, you can actually see that happening. You can zoom in on the strings and you can actually see the vibration of the strings through there. And if you have, if you've ever looked, there's some really cool videos out there that people put like a GoPro inside of an acoustic guitar looking out. And if you watch the strings, you'll see them vibrating at different rates. And that's how you're getting the different pitches out of there. The faster vibration is producing higher pitches. Okay? So we measure that in frequency. Right? How fast is it? How many vibrations do we have in a second? And in science, when we study things by how many times it happens per second, we use the unit Hertz, Hz. Okay? Hertz stands for cycles per second. Doesn't stand for it. That's what it means. It was named after the guy that coined that term, I guess, whatever. All right. So anything that rotates in cycles per second, we can actually measure in hertz, right? Your blinker, I know some of you have probably never used one before, but the blinker on your car that flashes is flashing in cycles per second, and you can actually count that out. It's slow enough that you could probably figure out the hertz of that pretty easily. How many times does it blink per second? Probably 2 for most cars, I think. Somewhere between 1 and 2. Any screen that you have, any kind of television or computer monitor or your cell phone screen, those are refreshing in a rate of cycles per second. That's when you hear about hertz when you're looking at TVs or looking at computer monitors. If you're a PC gamer, you know all about this. That's one of those stats that people get all excited about, right? I have a screen, the newest monitors out there are these 300 hertz monitors because they're refreshing super fast, which is really cool. Cell phones are the same way. Most of your kind of average cell phones out there are 60 hertz screens, 60 hertz displays, but now the kind of flagships have moved up to 90 hertz or 120 hertz displays. Okay, musical sounds work the exact same way. We measure them by how fast it cycles per second. When musical sounds, it's moving really fast most of the time. Okay? So if a pitch has a definite tone where we can isolate a single frequency that's the main frequency of that tone, it's said, of that pitch, it's said to be a tone. So a tone is a sound with a definite pitch. That's an assignment question, by the way, and a test question. A tone is a sound with a definite pitch. Tones have specific frequencies that we can identify and we can name. Okay? Modern music is all based around a specific frequency, and then it's divided up mathematically from there. The frequency that most music is based on is 440 hertz, which is the note A4 on the keyboard. That 440 hertz signal, it was decided hundreds of years ago that was going to be the basis on which we build our instruments, and that all of our musical scales are divided off of that. Okay, and then we use math to figure out how far we have between each note. So it's a big complicated process, and you don't want me to get into all that stuff. But know that 440 hertz is the baseline. Okay, there are some movements these days where people are using 435 or 432. There's different arguments to be made. We're not going to get into that stuff. You can watch some YouTube videos about it if you care. Right? The note middle C, which is the middle C on a keyboard, C4, that vibrates at 261.6 hertz. There's actually more decimal points after that, but we don't. Once you really get beyond a tenth of a hertz, we can't hear it anymore. Okay. If it is an irregular vibration, if it doesn't have a specific frequency that we can lock into, we don't call it a tone. We say it has indefinite pitch. So if you think about like crashing cymbals or a bass drum or a snare drum hit, those don't really have a defined pitch that we can lock into. If you look at and study the sound waves for those, it's very chaotic. It's a lot of stuff making it up. So those are said to have an indefinite pitch. Okay. Now, I want to talk about how we actually find that real quick before we talk about intervals, so that you can kind of understand what this concept is. So you can actually measure a sound wave, and we can look at it as a wave on a graph, basically, and it looks like this. Okay, so let's say that this line, our unit of time here, let's say that it's 1 second, that we're looking at a pitch over the course of 1 second. Okay, the way that we would figure out the frequency is by counting these peaks here. Okay, so if this is 1 second long, how many peaks do we have within that second? 3. So what would be the frequency? It'd be 3 hertz, 3 cycles per second. Okay, now 3 hertz is way beyond what humans can hear. You might be able to feel it if it was coming out of a big enough subwoofer, but that's way beyond the human range of hearing. We can hear down to about 20 hertz. Okay, so let's pretend like we've zoomed in a little bit further. Let's say that this unit of time is 1/100th of a second. So if we have 3 peaks happening in 1/100th of a second, what's the frequency? We take 3 hertz, 3 cycles per second, and we multiply that out by 100. So we have 300 cycles per second. Does that make sense? So if this were 1/100th of a second long, this frequency would be 300 hertz. Now 300 hertz just happens to sound like that. Okay? It's pretty close at least. That note is actually about 311 hertz or so, but it's close enough for what we're doing. Okay? So let's look at the next frequency, the bottom one on the slide. We're going to say this is the same unit of time. It's 1/100th of a second. How many peaks do you see in this frequency? 6. So what's the frequency? 600 hertz. Okay? So we have 300 up here, 600 up here, down here. Which one is going to be the higher pitch? 600 hertz. Right, it's a faster vibration. It's happening twice as fast, actually. Okay, so 600 hertz, if this is 300 hertz, if it's at least close, then 600 hertz is right there. Okay? So that's how we're actually finding those hertz, those cycles per second. Now, did you notice the relationship between those two? 300 to 600. Right? 600 is twice as fast as 300. So whenever we double or halve the frequency, we are said to be moving by an octave. Okay? An octave is a type of interval. It's another term you need to know for the test. An interval is the distance between any two notes. If I play any two notes on the piano, I can figure out what the interval between those two notes is. We have different names for the different intervals. You don't have to worry about them. The only interval that you need to know is the octave. And that occurs when we double or halve the frequency. And in music, notes that are in different octaves of each other will have the same letter name. So 300 hertz is the note D4. If I double that frequency, it's the note D5. We add that other number to it as we go up the scale. And that's 12 semitones up. So if I start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I have doubled the frequency. You can also just count letters on the piano, and we'll get into the lettering system later on. So if you know the frequency of one octave of a note, you can find the frequency of any other octave of that note. So we know that A4 is 440 hertz. That's the central bass unit that all of our music is based on. If I want to find the A below that, what do I need to do to the frequency? Cut it in half. So the A below A4 would be what frequency? 220. The A below that would be 110. The A below that, 55. I know it's early and it's rainy, so it's difficult to think about. And what about the A below that? The lowest A on the piano? 27.5. Yeah, exactly. Okay? And then we can go the other way if we want. We start on this A, which is 440. We go up the octave from there, and that's going to be what? 880. Okay? You can do the quick math to tell me what the next one's going to be.
1760.
Yeah, 1760. That's exactly right. Good. Okay? And it goes on from there. All right? Tones that are an octave apart tend to blend together really well. The frequencies just line up very nicely. So you notice that if I play octaves, they almost sound exactly the same. They blend together really well. We'll notice as we go through music history that we started with octaves or unisons in music, and then we added a fifth. And that sounds pretty good together. And then we gradually started getting closer and closer together to create the modern harmonic system. You don't need to worry about that stuff at the moment. Okay. So a pitch range of any object, of a person, of an instrument, of anything, is how low or high of a pitch that object or person can produce. Okay? How high or low you can sing, or how high or low you can play on the instrument. So we just figured out that the lowest pitch on the piano is 27.5 hertz. Okay, I don't know what the highest pitch is. Somebody could probably look it up. It's C8 if you care to look it up. But that's a really high pitch. Okay, it has a pretty big range. The flute, if you played the flute in high school, the average flute, just kind of the regular professional range of the flute, goes from C4, which is 261 hertz, up to C7, which is, right, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is about 2,000 hertz. So it has about a 3-octave range. Most wind instruments have about a 3-octave range. There's some that are larger. Clarinets have a slightly larger range because of the physics of the instrument. Brass instruments can go higher and lower just based on the ability of the player. Some flutes do have a extended low range. They have one more key down to give them a B. And a lot of flute players have also figured out how to do what are called altissimo notes, where you can do these weird fingerings and use funky techniques to get even higher notes out. But the regular range of the flute is from about C4 to C7. Okay? My vocal range, my personal vocal range, is from about D2, which is about 73.4 hertz. It's pretty low. I'm a bass baritone. From there to about F4, which is there. So I have about a 2.5 octave vocal range, which is pretty normal for an amateur vocalist, right? I'm not a professionally trained vocalist. Yes?
I was gonna say, I'm an alto too, alto 1 or 2 myself, so.
So your range is probably from about there to probably there, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So I, as an untrained vocalist, I wasn't in choir in high school. I was a band person. I have about a 2.5 octave range. I don't sing very often. I don't have a great voice. I usually write music for other people to sing, but that's about my range. I can get up to that F4 if I have to. I generally don't like to. And that's about as high as you're going to hear me get, comfortably. Beyond that, I have to put on tighter underwear. So I have about a 2.5 octave vocal. I just recorded that too, so that's good. We're going to edit that out. So that's my vocal range. If you're familiar with the guy Brendon Urie, the singer, he's the lead singer from Panic at the Disco. Panic at the Disco, I'm not a huge fan of their music. I like some of their songs, they're okay. But Brendon Urie is largely acknowledged as one of the best living rock and roll singers right now. He's an astounding musician. He has about a 5-octave range, which is pretty large. There have only been a few rock and roll singers in history that have had that kind of range. We think about people like, just lost it, the guy from Soundgarden. Whatever, it'll come to me later. Anyway, so Brendon Urie's range, he can sing as low as I can, down to the low D, but then he can go another 2.5 octaves above me, all the way up to that high C that the flutes can sing. And that's because he has a very fine-tuned falsetto range, or head voice. He can go up into those high notes. Now, we all have a head voice. You can all do the kind of Mickey Mouse voice if you really want to. But for most of us, it's not heavily developed. We don't like to sing in that range. Soprano singers, female singers that are sopranos, usually have a developed head voice like that. And that's why they're able to sing so high. And high tenors, like Brendon Urie, have that as well. They're able to get up really high because they've worked that range. Now, he is a classically trained singer. He's has spent a lot of time working on that range, and that's why he's able to do that. Okay, and there's also a little bit of physical talent there as well. Okay, my wife has about a 4-octave range. She has a pretty big range. She's when she was in choir, she could sing anything from alto 2 up to soprano 1. So these days, she prefers to sing low because she doesn't like to have to sing really loud to get the notes out. So most of the stuff I write for her is low, but she can sing the soprano parts in like a choir setting if she needs to. Okay, so that's pitch. Pitch is highness or lowness measured as a frequency and measured in hertz. Okay, the next unit of sound or element of sound that I want to talk about is dynamics. Okay, so pitch tells us the highness or lowness of it. Dynamics tell us how loud it is, how loud or soft the sound is. And dynamics are generally relative. Okay, so it's relative to within the piece of music, it's relative to the world around it. And when we're talking about dynamics in music, we very rarely are talking about specific scientific measurements. Now, you measure the loudness of something in decibels. There are decibel meters where you can stand out there and you can actually download a decibel meter on your phone and figure out how loud stuff is if you want. I pulled that up. My brother and I went to the Korn and Breaking Benjamin concert of, I guess back when they were still doing concerts, so probably about a year ago. And I was just curious, so I pulled up a decibel meter on my phone to see how loud it was. And it was like 110 decibels, which is pretty high. Once you get up to about 130, you start to have permanent hearing damage at that point. So like a jet, if you were standing next to a jet plane, that's about 130, 140 decibels. A marching band, if you're standing in front of like the U of A marching band or the UCA or Tech marching band, depending on the size of the marching band, those are usually going to be around 110, 120 decibels when they're playing full on. So anyway, but it's all relative. We don't worry too much about those decibels in music. Instead, we use these Italian terms to indicate the loudness of it. And you do need to be familiar with these terms. Now, fortunately, you don't necessarily just have to memorize the list because they kind of make sense. All right, you can ignore forte, piano, and sforzando. We're not going to talk about those. But if you can remember these two basic ones, forte and piano, everything else comes from there. Okay, so if the music is loud, or if we want the musicians to play loud, we write forte on the page. And we actually use this fancy little squiggly F, which means forte. That's the Italian term for loud. If we want it to be soft, or if we're describing music that's softer, we use the term piano. And we use a P to symbolize that. Now, for a long time, music didn't have written dynamics. Okay, it was up to the musician, it was up to the performer to figure out how loud or soft they were going to sing it or play it. Eventually, we started seeing composers add that in, and they added just the basic stuff, just forte or piano. There wasn't really any in between. Eventually, we started expanding that out a little bit, and we made it all relative to forte and piano. So if I want it to be really loud, I'm going to add a second F to it, and I'm going to call it fortissimo. Okay? If I want it to be really, really loud, I'm going to add a third F to it. I'm going to call it fortissimo. And then for every F we add to it from there, we just add another isi. The biggest I've seen, I think, was in a band piece I played in college that I think had 6 Fs in it. And that was basically just play as loud as you can without giving yourself an aneurysm. It was just super, super loud at that point. And then we could do the same thing going the other way. If we want it to be very soft, we do 2 Ps, and we call it pianissimo. If we want it to be very, very soft, we have 3 Ps, and that's pianissimo. And it just goes on from there. Okay? And of course, at a certain point, you might as well just not be playing. Now, if we want it to be in between forte and piano, we can add an M to it, which means mezzo, and that double Z, by the way, in Italian is pronounced S, like a TS sound, mezzo forte or mezzo piano. And that means moderately loud or moderately soft. Does that make sense? All right. So if we were going to put these on a scale from softest to loudest, the softest would be pianissimo, and then piano, and then mezzo piano. So all of the P's are the soft ones. And then mezzo forte, forte, and fortissimo from softest to loudest. Now, let's say we want to go in between those. We want to, instead of going suddenly from piano to forte, we want to gradually increase. But we have another Italian term for that, and that is crescendo. You've probably heard that term before. Okay? On sheet music, the crescendo looks like a hairpin or an alligator mouth or a less than symbol. And it actually kind of works the same way. The way that I learned in math how those worked was that the number on this side was less than the number on that side. Did you guys learn the same way? Okay, and it works the same way in music. The music that's on this side of the crescendo is softer than the music that's on this side of the crescendo. So as it opens up, it's getting louder. Does that make sense? So when you see that written on the page, you know that that means we're going to gradually get louder. And a lot of times they'll tell you from where to where. You're going to start at piano and you're going to go to mezzo forte. Or you're going to start at pianissimo and you're going to get to fortissimo. Okay, they'll kind of tell you how dramatic that crescendo needs to be. The opposite of that, if we go backwards, we call it a diminuendo. You can think of it as the sound is diminishing. Okay, a diminuendo means we're going to start loud and then we're going to get softer. So the music is gradually coming in, is gradually getting softer. Right? You may have also heard the term decrescendo if you were in band or choir in high school. Decrescendo basically means the same thing as the opposite of a crescendo, but the official Italian term that we use in music is diminuendo. Does that make sense? There's one other term with dynamics that you need to know, and that is an accent. An accent in music just means that I'm putting an emphasis on a particular note. So I could tap out a beat just by going, and there's no accent there. But if I start to emphasize certain beats, you can start to feel a rhythm there because I'm giving that an accent. Okay, so I'm emphasizing particular beats, and you can do that with melody as well. Most of the time we tend to accent what are called the strong beats. Bum, 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 bum. Da, 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 da. We put a little bit of an accent on the first of those notes. Okay? And we'll talk about what happens if we shift that accent around when we get to rhythm. That's really it with dynamics. Any questions about dynamics? It's telling you relatively how loud or soft it is, and you've got some Italian terms there that you need to know. All right, the third element of music that I want to spend some time talking about is tone color. And this one tends to confuse students a little bit. When I ask about tone color, I get a wide variety of responses on this. And I kind of want to explain this as simply as I can. First off, tone color does not have anything to do with actual physical colors. Okay? So if I ask about tone color of something, I'm not asking if it's blue or green or purple. That's not what I want to know. Okay? A tone color is an adjective that you use to describe the quality of the sound. Okay? It's a quality that identifies an instrument sound or a group of instrument sound. And that's just with different adjectives. Is it bright? Is it dark? Is it mellow? Is it harsh? Those are the kind of things that I'm looking for. All right? And for the most part, that's pretty subjective. Some people hear things differently. But for most of us, we would agree on something, on a lot of that stuff. If I were to play different versions of the electric piano sounds that this has built into it, that sound is pretty mellow as opposed to that sound. Do you hear the difference there? So that one's got a little bit more harshness. That one gets even brighter because it starts adding some stuff as opposed to that original sound. All right? That is the tone color that's telling you the difference there. It's the tone color that tells you the difference between if you're hearing an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar. And I think most of you can probably tell the difference there. Or between a flute and a saxophone. Now it gets harder with some instruments, especially with the string instruments, because their ranges overlap and their tone colors tend to be very similar, especially between like a violin and a viola. We'll talk about those on Thursday, and it can be very difficult to hear the difference between a violin and a viola. Okay, especially if the viola is playing in their higher register. The same thing with a cello and a bass. The ranges overlap so much that it can be difficult to tell them apart sometimes. But for others, it's a little bit more obvious. You know, we'll work on being able to tell a French horn from a trumpet or a trombone from a tuba, stuff like that. We have pretty much an unlimited variety of tone color in music. Composers these days can really explore that. And that became a focus of music towards the turn of the 20th century. The last 20 years of the 19th century or so, composers started digging into that. They started taking very simple melodies and exploring how they sound different with different combinations of instruments. And they started exploring new combinations of instruments to throw in there. And that's one of the reasons the orchestra expanded so much, was because we wanted to get all of these different tone colors in there. And then, of course, yes. I don't understand what you're asking.
On the bullet point, usually, what is it called? Modern electronic, tone colors, did you mean creates there?
Modern electronic techniques. Yeah, or techniques. Yeah, modern electronic techniques create new tone colors. Sorry, yeah, I left off the yes. Thank you.
Okay.
But that's where I was going from there, especially as we got into the 20th century. By 1950, we had these electronic synthesizers that would create different sounds, and we had a whole new palette that we could explore. That's why if you listen to some of the early electronic music from the 1950s and 60s, that music is weird, it's bizarre, and it's just because composers were exploring all of these new different tones that we could create. And we're still doing that. Synthesizers are still very popular. I've really gotten heavy into synthesizers now because it's so easy to create electronic music on your iPad. So that's where like most of my YouTube channel is all about that. I also have gotten into analog synthesizers that you kind of put together and patch things together to create all these different sounds. And it's really cool. It's really interesting to explore those tone colors. So we have an unlimited variety. We can also change how instruments sound by affecting them in some way. You can either change them physically. I can take a trumpet, and if I take this trumpet and I stick my mask up in it, it's going to change the tone of it. Even just covering it up with my hand, it's been a long time since I played a trumpet, so. Even just putting my hand in front of it, you can hear the difference in the tone color. Now, if I use something like this and put that in front of it, it's a lot more solid. You can really hear the difference in the tone color there. Okay? If I take a piano, and there was a composer named John Cage who in the like 30s and 40s started taking pianos and adding stuff to them. He would take these upright pianos and he would like screw in screws to the soundboard and tape things to the strings so that they would vibrate and create these really interesting tone colors. So there's an unlimited supply of stuff we can do. Of course, we can also run them through effects. There are some even trumpet players and saxophone players who like to run through guitar pedals to create these different tone colors. And of course, electric guitarists have a huge, unlimited supply of pedals that they can dig through and create all kinds of different tones. So it's wide open there. But when I ask you about the tone color of something, I'm just asking you to describe it. Use some kind of adjectives to describe it. Is it a thin sound? Is it a thick sound? That's kind of the stuff I'm looking for there. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay. Another word for tone color, and probably the more formal official word, is timbre. It is spelled with an I, Timbre, but is pronounced timbre, or timbre, if you want to be fancy. Okay. Most Americans pronounce it timbre. So if you hear me talking about the timbre of the piece, it's the same thing as the tone color. I go back and forth because I'm teaching music theory. We use the word timbre because that's the word that's on the AP Music Theory test. So I tend to use that one more often. Does that make sense? Okay, so we've got three categories of music that we've talked about. Pitch, which is the highness or lowness. Dynamics, which is the loudness and softness. and the tone color, which is just kind of a description of the quality of the sound, right? The fourth one was duration, and we don't even have a slide on duration because it's such a basic, simple concept. What does duration mean? How long it is, right? So that's the same thing in music. It's how long the sound is, okay? When we get into rhythm, we'll talk more about duration, and we'll start splitting it up into units, into beats per minute, and then how many divisions of the beat and all of that kind of stuff. We'll get into that later on. But duration just basically means how long it is. Okay? All right. So take a breather and open up on your laptop. By the way, you should have gotten everything from assignment 1.1 there. If you didn't get something, let me know. Go ahead and submit that for grading if you haven't already. And then I want you to go ahead and open up listening assignment 1.1. And we're going to talk about how to do these listening assignments. Okay? Collaborate, people. Are y'all still hanging in there? You guys still see the video okay and everything? Excellent. So you guys probably want to go ahead and open up listening assignment 1.1 as well. And we're going to go through that together, how to do that. Okay, so in the textbook, with each chapter, it's going to have some different songs that it likes to talk about, some different pieces of music that it wants to give you some information on. And I have taken those and I've created these listening assignments based on the music that's in the textbook that it wants you to talk about. Okay? So I've got a digital version of the textbook here. I may have to re-log in to get it to load. Yeah. Just 1 second. I was having internet trouble this morning, so I didn't think about getting this loaded. So we'll take just a minute. All right, so you guys don't have access to all this stuff because I didn't make you buy the $130 code. But you do have access to the textbook, and it looks the exact same. So this is chapter 1 of the textbook. And if you go down to the end of that textbook, it's got a couple of pieces of music here in these listening outlines. Okay? So you've got Stravinsky's Firebird Suite, and then down below that, we've got CJM Blues by Duke Ellington. So these listening outlines will have this brown box that tells you specific things to listen for, and then it kind of takes you minute by minute through the piece of music and tell you what's happening. Now, you don't have access to the exact recordings that these are based on, but in those listening assignments, I tried to get recordings that were close, at least, to the ones that these are based on. Okay? So this is what those listening assignments are based on. Now, just as a reminder, to get to the listening assignments, you go over here to the menu, to course materials, and then the section that we're on, which is part 1 in this case, and then scroll down to listening assignment 1.1. That's where we're going to start. So listening assignment 1.1 is related to chapter 1 of part 1 of the book. Part 1, chapter 1 is 1.1. Okay? So when you click on it to open it, it should look something like this. Now, with these listening assignments, these numbered listening assignments, 1.1, 1.2, all the way through the end of the year, these you have to complete as a Word document and save it and upload it back up into the system. I've had some people that have been trying to copy these like we do the daily listenings. That's not what I want you to do on this, okay? I want you to complete it like a Word document on the Word document and upload it into Blackboard. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if you're using a MacBook and it opens in Pages, you're going to need to export it to a document, to a .doc file, or to a PDF file whenever you upload it, so that I can see it. Okay. But for everybody else, you should be good to go. Okay, so for this piece, I've got Firebird, Scene 2 by Igor Stravinsky, which lines up with the first piece that's in Chapter 1. And then I've got 5 questions here. I do have this Spotify link for you. I also sent out a YouTube link if that Spotify link wasn't working for you. If you check the announcements page on Blackboard, there's a YouTube link there. But when we do these in class, I'm actually going to pull up the real McGraw-Hill recording that they use, which looks like this. Now, for these listening assignments, this is the only one that we're actually going to do together in class. We will listen to some of these pieces, but we won't listen to all of it. One of the reasons I added these assignments is just because we don't have enough class time to listen to every one of these pieces. So I wanted to make sure that you're listening to these pieces on your own outside of class as part of the expectation for the course. So for this piece of music, go ahead and read through these 5 questions, what it's asking you about, and then we're going to listen to it, and I'll talk you through this first one so you have an idea of what I'm asking for here. So this is Stravinsky's Firebird Suite, Scene 2, written in 1910. So now we can use this information and we can use what we've heard and the information in the book to go back and answer these questions. So the first question in 1.1 is, what instruments are used in this piece? Okay, so if you go to the textbook, it actually gives you a list of all of the instruments that are used. Now, before you start frantically typing, you do not have to type every one of these instruments in. Okay, what you can do is you can break these up. If there's more than 10 instruments, you can break them up by category or family. We're going to talk more about that on Thursday. So I'll help you out with this one. You've got piccolo, flutes, oboes, English horn, clarinets, bass clarinet, bassoons, and contrabassoons. Those are all part of the woodwind family. So you've got woodwinds. And then you have French horns, trumpets, and tuba. Those are brass instruments. So we've got woodwinds, brass instruments, or brasses. And then we've got timpani, triangle, cymbals, and bass drum, which are all percussion instruments. And then the rest of them, harps, violins, violas, cellos, and double basses, are the string instruments. So you could just put woodwinds, brass, percussion, and strings there. Now, somebody asked me yesterday, why can't we just put orchestra? Because it's obviously just a full orchestra. The reason for that is because the orchestra evolved over, really, the orchestra first showed up about 400, 500 years ago, and it's evolved pretty heavily since then. So the orchestra from the 1600s is is a lot different than the orchestra from 1910. Okay. So those are the instruments. With a smaller group, like we're going to listen to a jazz piece in a minute that has less than 10 people, then I want you to go ahead and list the individual instruments there, because that can vary. Now, if it's a string quartet, you can list it as a string quartet. If it's a brass quintet, you can do that. Okay, but otherwise, I do want you to list the individual instruments if it's a small group. Okay. Next question is, what is the overall dynamic shape? I have gotten many phone calls asking, what does that mean? What is the dynamic shape? What does that mean? And that's basically looking at the piece. If you were to write this out as a graph and have as the x-axis, the horizontal axis, I'm not a math, I haven't done math since 2002. So the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis is the dynamic, and you were to pick different points, maybe even use the sections of the piece. What's happening to the dynamics? How does that look? So this first section, it even tells you here, what is the dynamic for the first section? The dynamic is piano. Remember, dynamic is how soft or loud, and that's where we're using those Italian terms. So the first section is piano. The next section gets a little bit louder. We have a little bit of a crescendo, so we would make that line go up, or the next dot would be a little higher. The next section gets all the way up to forte. And as we continue, we go up to fortissimo. But then at 134, we have a quick dip down for about 5 seconds. It drops down to pianissimo. But after 5 seconds, or 6 seconds or so, it's back up to fortissimo. And then that continues, even more fortissimo, adding more instruments, which is going to make it even louder. And then we get all the way up to fortissimo, and then again we have a sudden drop back down to pianissimo, but then it ends with another very loud ending chord at the end. So other than those two little dips where it dropped down, what's the overall shape of the dynamics on that graph? What is it doing? Yeah, you should do that. It's like the GIF that you see of the Arsenal coach. It's a ramp. Okay? The majority of the scene is spent building towards a climax. That's what Mary put online. And that's exactly right. It's a build. It's gradually crescendoing up. The overall shape, and I think the textbook says that sentence exactly, that the whole piece is a gradual crescendo. For over 3 minutes, it gradually goes from piano to fortissimo. It gradually just gets louder and louder and louder with a couple of little dips in it. Okay? Or a ramp. You can think of it as a ramp up into a crescendo. Does that make sense? Some pieces, the dynamic shape will be that it starts loud and gets soft. Some will start soft and get loud and get soft again. So they'll have this kind of bell curve shape. Some of them will have what's called tiered dynamics, where it's soft and then loud and then soft and then loud, and it goes back and forth, and there's no really in between there. Okay? That's one of the things that I want you listening for when we're going through this music. Okay? And I promise I'm going to let you go on time. When does this class get out? 45? At 40? Okay, so we got about 3 minutes. Okay. So since we're running low on time, I want to just cover these last 3 questions, and then you can do the second piece by yourselves. So the instruments that provide the melody at 105, again, if you look in the textbook, at 103, it tells you right here, the violins and the flutes have the melody. At 140, the brasses have the melody. So those 2 answers are just straight from the book. Easy enough. And then the last one is the overall characteristic of this piece. That is subjective. It's kind of an opinion. It's how would you describe this piece of music? What kind of adjectives would you use to describe this piece of music? And some examples are, some people on Monday said things like triumphant or dramatic or intense. So, or it starts very mysterious and it moves into a dramatic and triumphant style. That's what I'm looking for there. And again, that's going to be, that's one of those, there's not really a wrong answer, or the only wrong answer is I don't know. That's usually how I look at those. So it's really just you describing that, the piece, using adjectives. Does that make sense? Okay. The second section of that I think you can do on your own. Let me know if you have any questions. If any of you guys have any questions, you can ask them now, or you can come talk to me after class. Collaborate people, you can put questions in the chat, or if you'll give me a minute to get everybody out the door, then I'll let you ask over your mic, and maybe I can help you. Thank you, Collaborate people, for tolerating the internet issues. I will have a video up later on that I recorded on my laptop, so you'll be able to maybe see and hear a little bit better if you missed something. Okay, thank you very much. Y'all have a good day. I'll see you on Thursday.